Under the blazing Texas sun, a ruthless millionaire put his untamable stallion up for auction, certain no one could ever control the beast. The crowd gasped as bidders threw out enormous sums, eager for the challenge. But then, out of nowhere, a poor barefoot boy stepped forward, carrying nothing but a jar of coins, and in that moment, the impossible began. The Texas sun blazed down on the wide, rolling fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Dust swirled in the dry wind, rattling the brittle wooden fences of Harrison's ranch. The land was vast, impressive, the kind of place that spoke of power and wealth. But inside one of the corrals, chained by iron and surrounded by reinforced rails, stood the creature that gave even seasoned ranch hands nightmares. Midnight. He was massive, his black coat shimmering like polished obsidian under the unforgiving sun. Muscles rippled beneath his hide, each breath rising like thunder in his chest. His eyes were what unsettled people most. A pair of burning coals, fierce and wild, that seemed to hold both fury and sorrow. When he reared, the sound of his hooves against the wooden beams rang like gunshots, splintering the rails and shaking the ground. The ranch hands gave him space, some nursing old bruises and scars from failed attempts to tame him. Inside the big ranch house, Harrison watched from his window. He was a man in his late 50s, gray hair combed back sharply, his face carved with lines of pride and exhaustion. He had built his fortune in real estate, buying land, selling land, turning dirt into gold. He liked control. He liked order. But midnight was chaos, a storm that refused to be mastered. "Enough," he muttered, slamming his fist against the desk. Contracts and maps scattered across the polished surface. "I've wasted too much time and too much money on this beast. He'll be someone else's problem now." He called for his foreman, a weathered man named Jack. "Make the arrangements," Harrison ordered. "The summer fair's auction is next week. Midnight goes under the hammer." Jack hesitated. "Sir, no one in this county wants that horse. He's put more men in the doctor's office than any bronco I've ever seen." "Then let them come and try," Harrison snapped, his voice cold. "If they want a trophy, let them pay for it. I don't care if they succeed or fail. I just want him gone." Back in the corral, Midnight pawed at the dirt, nostrils flaring as if he understood every word. His mane whipped in the wind, and when he let out a scream, it wasn't just a cry of anger. It was the cry of something trapped too long, something that still remembered freedom. The ranch hands stepped back, shaking their heads. Harrison turned away from the window, but his eyes lingered for a moment longer. Somewhere deep inside, buried beneath years of business deals and hardened pride, a thought flickered like a spark. What if no one could ever tame him? What if this horse was meant for more than to be locked away or sold like cattle? He pushed it aside, hard. Men like Harrison didn't believe in sparks or fate. They believed in numbers, in profits, in cutting their losses. Midnight was a failure in his books, and failures had no place in his empire. The decision was made. Midnight's days on this ranch were numbered. But neither Harrison nor anyone else in the town could have predicted that fate had already begun weaving another thread into Midnight's story, a thread that would come from the most unlikely place, a small boy with nothing to his name but a heart that refused to give up. Far beyond the fences of Harrison's empire, in a worn-out wooden house on the edge of town, a boy named Ethan would soon hear the whispers about the horse called Untamable. And when those whispers reached his ears, nothing in either of their lives would ever be the same again. The little town on the edge of the Texas plains was a place where life moved slow, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets. Dust clung to every porch, cicadas sang endlessly in the trees, and the nights were filled with the smell of mesquite smoke and the distant howls of coyotes. In a weather-beaten wooden house at the end of a dirt road lived Ethan and his mother. Their home leaned slightly to one side, patched up with scrap wood and hope, but it held the warmth of love, something Ethan treasured more than anything else. Ethan was only 9, but the world had already shown him its rough edges. His father had passed away years ago, leaving behind little more than an old toolbox and a stack of unpaid bills. His mother worked long hours at the local diner, carrying plates heavier than she was, her back bent with fatigue, but her eyes still soft whenever they landed on her boy. She never said it aloud, but every wrinkle in her smile told the story of sacrifices made for Ethan's sake. From the moment he could walk, Ethan had been drawn to horses. He would press his face against the dusty windows of barns just to glimpse their powerful bodies moving in the half-light. To him, horses weren't just animals. They were freedom. They were the wide-open plains, the endless horizon, the feeling of wind rushing past your face. He dreamed of having one of his own, though the thought seemed as distant as the stars above his small bed. Most evenings, when his mother was at work, Ethan would sneak away to the edge of Harrison's sprawling ranch. There, hidden among tall grass and wooden posts, he would stare through the gaps in the fence at the herd. He always knew when midnight was there. The stallion's dark form stood out even in the fading light, his restless movements shaking the earth. The other horses gave him space, as though even they feared his presence. But Ethan didn't feel fear. What he saw in Midnight's eyes wasn't just fury, it was loneliness. It was the same emptiness Ethan sometimes felt when the nights were too, quiet and the house too big for just him and his mother. One hot afternoon, as Ethan wandered into town with a small list of groceries crumpled in his hand, he overheard 2 men talking near the general store. Their voices carried low, conspiratorial, but the words struck him like lightning. "They're finally putting that devil horse up for auction," one of the men muttered, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "Midnight," the other said, raising his brows. "I thought Harrison would keep him locked up forever." "Harrison's done. Says the beast's not worth the trouble. They'll sell him at the summer fair next week." Could be the spectacle of the year. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had to steady himself against the store's wooden post, the list of groceries forgotten in his hand. Midnight. The horse he had watched from afar, the one that set his heart racing every time their eyes seemed to meet across the fence, sold at an auction. The thought swirled inside him, dizzying, intoxicating. The men walked away, still chuckling, but Ethan stood rooted to the ground. For a moment, he imagined it, standing there at the auction, holding Midnight's reins, leading him home like a friend found at last. His chest swelled with a mixture of hope and fear so strong he thought he might burst. He ran home, his bare feet kicking up clouds of dirt, his heart hammering. His mother was outside, shaking crumbs off a faded tablecloth. She looked up in surprise as Ethan skidded to a stop, his face red and eyes blazing. "Mom," he gasped. "They're selling him, the black stallion from Harrison's ranch." Midnight, at the fair next week. His mother's smile faltered, her expression tightening into concern. "Ethan, don't. We could buy him," Ethan blurted out. "I could work." "I could save. I'll do anything." "Mom?" Her face softened, but her voice was weary. "Sweetheart, we don't have that kind of money." Horses are not just expensive to buy, they're expensive to keep. Feed, medicine, shelter. It's a dream, baby. Just a dream. But Ethan couldn't let it go. He stood there, fists clenched, tears burning the corners of his eyes. You don't understand. He needs me. No one else sees it, but I do. He's not just angry, he's sad, like he's waiting for someone who won't give up on him. For a long moment, his mother just stared at him, the breeze tugging at her hair. She wanted to crush the hope before it grew too wild, wanted to protect him from disappointment. But in Ethan's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in years, a light, fierce and unshakable. The same light his father once had when he talked about fixing up their home or making a better life. She knelt, brushing the dirt from his cheeks with rough hands. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "dreams are dangerous things for people like us. But if this is what you want, if you believe it's meant to be, then maybe you'll find a way." That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. The sound of cicadas drifted through the window, and the faint smell of hay still clung to his shirt from the ranch fence. He imagined Midnight's dark eyes, the way they seemed to hold storms inside them. He imagined touching his mane, whispering words only they would understand. His fists tightened around the thin blanket. He knew what he had to do. Somehow, some way, he would find the money. He would stand at that auction, no matter how small he looked beside the men in fine suits. And when they laughed at him, he would not back down. Midnight was waiting. Midnight needed him. And Ethan, for the first time in his young life, felt like he had something worth fighting for. The next morning, the air was heavy with the scent of dew and the faint sweetness of wildflowers clinging to the edges of the dusty road. Ethan sat at the worn kitchen table, his head bent low over a scrap of notebook paper where he had scribbled clumsy calculations. Pennies, nickels, and dimes were scattered in front of him, the small beginnings of what he imagined could one day buy a horse. His hands moved with the stubbornness of someone much older than 9, stacking and restacking coins, as though determination alone could multiply them. His mother, Mary, moved around the kitchen, the sound of her footsteps tired but steady. She poured coffee into a chipped mug and leaned against the counter, watching her son silently. She had not slept well. All night she had heard Ethan's restless turning in the bed across the thin wall, and in her heart she knew his dreams had already taken root too deeply to be pulled out. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice heavy with both tenderness and worry. "You know what you're thinking isn't possible, don't you?" He looked up, eyes wide, the coins shining in the morning light. "Why not? If I work hard enough, if I save every cent, maybe—" She shook her head firmly, setting the mug down with a thud. "It isn't just about buying him. Horses eat more than we do. They get sick. They need land, shelter, shoes for their hooves. Even people with money struggle to keep one. You can't just wish that away." Ethan's throat tightened, but he pushed back, his voice trembling but fierce. "I don't care about the money. Midnight needs someone who believes in him, Mom. Everyone else sees a monster, but I see more than that. He looks trapped, like he's waiting for someone to give him a chance." Mary pressed her lips together, her heart aching at the fire in her son's eyes. That fire was dangerous. It could burn too brightly and leave only ashes. She turned to the window, staring out at the dirt yard where weeds pushed stubbornly through cracks in the earth. "Dreams can be cruel, Ethan. They can make you hope for things that the world will never give you. I don't want you to hurt when some reality reminds you of who we are and what we don't have." The boy's chest rose and fell quickly, his small fists clenching at his sides. "But maybe dreams are the only things we do have," he whispered, his voice raw with the desperation of a child who already knew too much about what was missing from life. Mary spun around, startled by the weight of his words. For a moment, she saw her late husband in him, saw the same stubborn defiance that once made her believe they could build a better life together. It frightened her. It made her want to hold him and never let go, to protect him from the world that had already taken so much from them. But she also knew that trying to crush that spark would be like suffocating him. She knelt beside him, her hands rough from years of labor, as she cupped his small face. "Ethan, you are my whole world. I need you to promise me you'll be careful. That horse is dangerous. People twice your size have been thrown to the ground trying to tame him. He could break your bones without even trying." His eyes filled with tears, but he did not look away. "I'm not afraid of him, Mom. Not if I can show him I'm not like the others. I don't want to tame him. I just want him to know he's not alone." Her breath caught, and for a moment the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Mary pulled him into a tight embrace, pressing his head against her chest. "You sound so much older than you are," she whispered into his hair. "Too old for 9. Sometimes I wish I could keep you little forever." The boy clung to her, but his heart was already racing ahead, galloping toward a future that felt more real than the sagging walls of their home. That evening, after Mary left for her shift at the diner, Ethan wandered back to the edge of Harrison's ranch. The sky glowed orange and purple with the setting sun, cicadas buzzing loudly in the trees. He crouched near the fence, his eyes fixed on the corral where Midnight stood apart from the other horses. The stallion pawed at the dirt restlessly, his dark coat gleaming like fire in the twilight. Ethan whispered through the fence rails, as though the horse could hear him. "They don't understand you. But I do. I promise I'll find a way." Midnight lifted his head, ears flicking, and for the briefest of moments their eyes met across the distance. The wildness in the horse's gaze seemed to soften, just a fraction, before he turned and trotted away into the shadows of the corral. Ethan stayed there long after the light faded, his knees sore from crouching, his heart brimming with a determination that no warning could extinguish. His mother's voice still echoed in his ears, full of fear and love. But inside him another voice spoke louder, the quiet, steady beat of hope, refusing to be silenced. By the time he rose to his feet and walked home beneath the first stars of night, Ethan had already made his choice. He would prove her wrong, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Midnight was waiting, and nothing in the world could keep him away. The days that followed were long and blistering, filled with the relentless Texas sun that seemed determined to test the endurance of anyone beneath it. Ethan woke each morning before his mother left for the diner, determined to prove to her, and perhaps to himself, that his dream wasn't just a child's fantasy. With a battered glass jar tucked under his bed, he began collecting every coin he could earn, no matter how small. At first, it was the neighbors who gave him odd jobs, half out of pity and half out of admiration for the boy's stubborn spirit. Mr. Walker, an old farmer with fields that stretched toward the horizon, let Ethan pull weeds from his garden in exchange for a handful of nickels. The boy's small hands blistered quickly, but he pressed on, ignoring the sting. Then came Mrs. Thompson, who needed help cleaning her chicken coop. Ethan gagged at the smell, but he forced himself to work until the floor was swept and the birds settled. All for a few dimes that clinked sweetly in his jar. Every task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward midnight. Ethan's body ached, his knees scraped, his clothes dirt-stained, but at night he would pour the coins onto his bed, arranging them into neat stacks and running his fingers over them as though they were treasure. To him, they were more valuable than gold. Lily, his best friend since kindergarten, watched with wide eyes as Ethan pushed himself harder each day. She lived just 2 houses away, her pigtails always tied in mismatched ribbons, her laughter quick and bright. When she found him one afternoon hauling buckets of water for the Smiths' horses, she jumped in without hesitation, splashing mud up to her knees as she helped. "You'll wear yourself out," she teased, brushing hair from her sweaty forehead. "I don't care," Ethan said, gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Every penny matters." She tilted her head, her smile softening. "You really think you can buy him? Midnight? He's huge, Ethan. He looks like he could stomp through a brick wall." Ethan paused, resting against the fence, his chest heaving. "He's not mean. He just doesn't trust anyone. But if I can be the one to show him, then maybe he won't be alone anymore." "And neither will I," Lily studied him for a long moment, then nodded firmly. "Then I'm helping." No more arguing. Together, they became a team. Lily convinced her parents to let her set up a lemonade stand by the roadside, and Ethan helped her haul the crate of lemons and sugar out each morning. The stand was nothing more than 2 planks nailed together, a sign written in Lily's uneven handwriting. But the townsfolk came. Some bought lemonade because they were thirsty. Others came because they'd heard about the boy saving for something impossible. Coins dropped into the jar with a music sweeter than any song. Still, not everyone was kind. Some men laughed openly when they saw Ethan walking through town with his jar. "A horse?" one of them barked, his belly shaking with laughter. "Kid, you'd need 100 jars just to look at the thing, let alone own it." The words stung, but Ethan refused to let them stick. He kept his head down, clutching the jar against his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. One evening, after a long day of working in the fields, Ethan trudged home with dirt caked on his arms and sweat dripping into his eyes. His mother stood on the porch, arms crossed, her gaze both worried and proud. "You're going to break yourself," she said, though her voice carried no real anger. Ethan dropped the coins he had earned into the jar with a clink and wiped his brow. "If I stop now, I'll never get him." "And I have to, Mom. Don't you see? It's not just about me wanting a horse. Midnight. He needs someone. He's like me. Everyone thinks he's trouble, but maybe he's just waiting for someone to understand him." Mary's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that a horse was just an animal and not a mirror for a boy's heart. But deep down she couldn't. She saw the fire in him, and she knew it was the same fire that had driven her husband before life wore him down. She pressed her lips together and nodded faintly, her silence giving Ethan permission to keep trying. That night, Ethan and Lily sat cross-legged on the floor of his small room, pouring the coins onto the rug. The stacks grew taller, but when they counted, the total still felt heartbreakingly small compared to the numbers Ethan had heard whispered about auctions. "It's not enough," Lily whispered, her voice quivering. "It doesn't matter," Ethan said firmly, his jaw set. "I'll keep going. Even if it takes forever." She looked at him with shining eyes, her faith in him unshaken. "Then I'll be with you every step." The days turned into weeks, each one marked by Ethan's determination. His hands toughened, his shoulders grew stronger, and the jar grew heavier. And though the road ahead stretched long and uncertain, his heart beat with a rhythm that matched the gallop of a horse he had not yet touched, but already loved. The world might laugh, the odds might crush him, but Ethan refused to stop. Midnight was out there, and Ethan knew, down to his bones, that their stories were already tangled together, waiting for the day when fate would pull the knot tight. The town of Red Bluff lay quiet beneath the blazing summer sun, the air thick with dust and the scent of cattle. The wooden storefronts creaked in the wind, and dogs sprawled lazily in the shade of porches. For Ethan, though, the world never seemed still. His mind was always racing, his legs always running, his eyes always searching for the next task that could earn him a coin. His glass jar, hidden beneath his bed, grew heavier by the week, but never enough to silence the whispers in his head that said it wouldn't matter in the end. One afternoon, after helping Mrs. Thompson carry sacks of feed into her barn, Ethan wandered toward the edge of Harrison's ranch again. He knew he shouldn't, but the pull of midnight was too strong. He crouched by the fence, staring through the slats as the black stallion paced inside his corral, snorting and pawing at the earth. Dust rose around his legs, and the sunlight caught his mane like a halo of fire. Ethan whispered, barely moving his lips, "I'm still trying. I'll find a way to bring you home." The voice that answered wasn't the horse's. "You shouldn't be here, son." Ethan spun around, startled, to see Sheriff Collins standing just behind him. The sheriff's tall frame cast a long shadow across the ground. His uniform was faded from years of wear, his hat tilted low over eyes that had seen too much of the world's harshness. His badge gleamed dully in the light, a quiet reminder of the authority he carried in Red Bluff. Ethan's throat went dry. I was just looking." The sheriff's gaze followed the boy's eyes to Midnight, who had stopped pacing and now stood, muscles taut. Ears flicked forward as though listening to the conversation. Collins sighed, crossing his arms. "That horse is trouble, Ethan. He's already put grown men in the dirt. Broke a ranch hand's arm last spring. Nearly trampled another. He ain't meant for boys to be dreaming about." Ethan swallowed hard, but he didn't back away. "He's not bad. He's just angry. No one understands him." Collins tilted his head, studying the boy. There was no mockery in his eyes, only concern. "Sometimes anger is what makes a creature dangerous. Don't mistake danger for sadness. You're just a kid. You don't know how quick that horse could end you." The words struck Ethan like a slap, but instead of crumbling, he stiffened. "I'm not afraid of him." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He had seen that look before, the reckless determination of men who thought they could outstare the wildness of nature. Most of them had scars to show for it, if they were lucky enough to survive. He crouched to meet Ethan's gaze, his voice low. "Fear keeps you alive. You don't have to be ashamed of it. But running headfirst into something you don't understand, that'll bury you." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "He's not just something. He's Midnight, and he's mine. He just doesn't know it yet." Collins stared at him, searching for the right words. For a moment he almost smiled, though it was touched with sadness. "You sound like your daddy when he was your age." He thought he could fix everything, too. The boy blinked, startled. "You knew my dad?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "Knew him well enough?" "He had a good heart, same as you. But a heart like that, if it ain't careful, can get broken clean in two. Just promise me you'll think before you do something foolish." Ethan wanted to argue. wanted to shout that this wasn't foolish at all, that it was the truest thing he'd ever felt, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he just nodded stiffly. Collins rose, brushing dust from his trousers. He gave Midnight one last wary look. "That horse won't let anyone close. Don't go believing you'll be the one to change him. Life doesn't work like the stories you kids tell each other." As the sheriff walked away, his boots crunching on the dry earth, Ethan turned back toward the corral. Midnight's eyes were still on him, dark and burning, and for an instant, the boy swore the stallion understood everything that had just been said. Ethan pressed his hands against the fence, whispering fiercely, "They don't believe in you. But I do. I always will inside the corral." Midnight stomped once, a sharp, powerful sound that echoed across the empty field. Ethan took it as an answer, a promise that bound them together more tightly than any warning could unravel. When he finally walked home under the blood-red sunset, Sheriff Collins's words lingered in his mind. They were meant to frighten him, to turn him back. But instead, they only hardened his resolve. Dreams were dangerous. That much was true. But so was giving up. And Ethan knew which danger he was willing to face. The days in Red Bluff seemed to blur together as the summer wore on, each one hotter and heavier than the last. Dust coated the streets like a second skin, and the air shimmered above the wide, cracked roads leading into town. For most people, the coming of the summer fair was a bright spot in the endless grind of ranch work and small-town routine. The fair meant music, rides, stalls filled with food, and most importantly, the auction that drew wealthy buyers from across the county. But for Ethan, the fair was more than just a celebration. It was the line between dream and reality. Every morning he woke before the sun, the sound of cicadas already buzzing through the thin walls of his home. He would tiptoe to the jar beneath his bed, lift it with both hands, and shake it lightly just to hear the coins clink together. The sound was a promise, a heartbeat reminding him of what was coming. Yet each time he poured them out and counted, the truth cut into him like a dull blade. The money wasn't nearly enough. No matter how many weeds he pulled, no matter how much lemonade Lily sold, the jar would never stand against the thick wallets of men in cowboy hats and polished boots who would soon crowd into the auction yard. Still, Ethan refused to let despair take root. He threw himself into every task that came his way. He carried heavy sacks until his shoulders ached, mended fences with hands rubbed raw, and even cleaned stalls that reeked so badly he thought he might be sick. His mother's warnings still echoed in his ears, and the sheriff's stern words followed him like a shadow, but his resolve only grew sharper. Midnight wasn't just a horse. Midnight was waiting for him. At night, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sweat clinging to his skin in the stifling heat. Sometimes his mother would peek into the room, her tired eyes softening when she saw him awake. "Sleep, Ethan," she would whisper. "Dreams can't grow if you don't rest." He would nod, close his eyes, and pretend to drift off. But inside, his mind was already at the fair, standing before midnight with the whole town watching. Lily came by almost every day, her energy a constant spark that kept Ethan from sinking into doubt. Together they dragged their rickety lemonade stand to the busiest corner of town. She called out cheerfully to passers-by, and Ethan squeezed lemons until his hands stung. The coins came slowly, dropped into the tin box with a clatter that always made Ethan smile. Some people gave them money out of kindness, others out of amusement, but every coin mattered. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Lily asked one sweltering afternoon as they counted the day's earnings. Her pigtails were frizzed with sweat, and her cheeks burned red from the sun. Ethan stared at the small pile of quarters and nickels. He wanted to lie, to say yes, but the truth pressed too hard against his chest. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But I can't stop now." She reached over, squeezing his hand. "Then neither will I." The days slipped away, and the fair grew closer. Red Bluff came alive with preparations. Banners were strung across Main Street, painted with bright colors that fluttered in the hot breeze. Stalls were hammered together, and the smell of roasting meat and kettle corn drifted through the air. Children ran excitedly through town, chasing after wagons filled with hay and supplies. Even the adults, weary from long days under the sun, couldn't help but smile at the coming festivities. But beneath the excitement was the steady drumbeat of the auction. Everyone was talking about it. Harrison's horse, the one no one could tame, was finally being sold. Farmers whispered in disbelief, ranchers scoffed, and wealthy men polished their boots in anticipation. Midnight had become more than just a horse. He was a legend, a challenge, a prize. Ethan heard the whispers every time he passed through town. Some people chuckled, shaking their heads when they saw the jar he carried under his arm. "That boy thinks he's gonna buy Harrison's devil horse," they murmured. "Poor kid. Doesn't know the world don't work that way." But Ethan kept his chin high. He had grown used to the laughter, used to the sideways glances. He knew most of them would be there at the fair, ready to watch him fail. And that only made him more determined. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the fields in gold, Ethan walked out to the edge of Harrison's ranch once. More Midnight stood in his corral, restless as ever, his coat glistening with sweat. He kicked at the rails, snorted, and reared back with a ferocity that made the earth tremble. But when Ethan whispered through the fence, the stallion's ears flicked forward, and for a heartbeat, he stilled. Their eyes met across the fading light, and Ethan felt something he couldn't explain. A connection that went deeper than fear or longing. The fair was only days away. Soon, the moment would come when Ethan's dream and the world's reality would collide. Whether he rose or fell, whether he won or lost, he knew there was no turning back. Midnight was waiting, and Ethan would be there, no matter the cost. The morning of the fair arrived with the sharp scent of dust and frying oil already hanging in the air. Red Bluff was alive before the sun had fully risen. Wagons rattled down the streets, their wheels creaking under loads of hay, barrels, and crates of supplies. The square had been transformed overnight into a bustling patchwork of stalls, banners, and makeshift stages. Bright colors flapped in the hot wind, and laughter mingled with the distant music of a fiddle. Children darted between booths clutching sticky sweets, while men and women strolled slowly, inspecting everything from saddles to jars of homemade preserves. But at the center of all the noise and excitement stood the auction pen. The wooden ring was freshly mended, the rails thick and reinforced, and benches circled the enclosure. A stage had been built for the auctioneer, complete with a microphone and loudspeakers that would carry every word across the grounds. Already people filled the seats, murmuring, pointing, and glancing toward the pen where the infamous horse would soon appear. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching his glass jar so tightly his fingers ached. His mother had begged him not to come, had tried one last time the night before to talk him out of it. She had cried, her tired hands trembling as she pressed them against his cheeks. But Ethan had only hugged her tightly, whispering that he had to try. Now, As he stood among men in pressed shirts and polished boots, he felt smaller than ever. Lily appeared at his side, her braids neat for once, her dress patched but clean. She carried a paper cup of lemonade from their stand, thrusting it into his hands. "Drink," she ordered, her voice firm despite the tremble in her eyes. "You look like you're about to pass out." He nodded, sipping gratefully, though his stomach churned too much to swallow. Around them, the crowd grew louder, anticipation crackling like heat lightning. Everyone was waiting for the same thing: the moment Harrison unveiled Midnight. Harrison himself stood near the auction stage, towering in his crisp suit, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. He spoke briefly with the auctioneer, his voice calm, his face unreadable. To the people of Red Bluff, he looked every inch the wealthy landowner, a man in command of everything he touched. But when his gaze flicked toward the corral where Midnight waited, a shadow crossed his features. He masked it quickly, but Ethan saw it, and for the first time wondered if the man feared his own horse. The auction began with smaller lots: saddles, harnesses, young cattle, even a few ponies. The bids came fast and loud, the numbers climbing higher and higher, the crowd cheering with each strike of the gavel. Ethan tried to listen, but the words blurred together. His heart thumped in his chest like a drum, every beat echoing Midnight's hooves in his imagination. Then the moment came. The auctioneer raised his hand for silence, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the lot you've all been waiting for." A stallion unlike any other in this county, strong, fierce, untamed. Harrison's Midnight. The gates creaked open, and the black stallion exploded into the ring like a storm unleashed. He reared high, hooves slashing at the air, a scream ripping from his throat that silenced the crowd. Dust swirled as he landed, muscles rolling under his gleaming coat. The handlers clung to the ropes, their boots sliding in the dirt as Midnight bucked and twisted, eyes blazing with fury. The crowd gasped, some stepping back instinctively, though thick rails separated them from the beast. Ethan's breath caught. Midnight was even more magnificent up close, every line of his body carved from power and fire. But beneath the rage, Ethan swore he saw something else flicker in those dark eyes. The same loneliness he had glimpsed before, the same ache that mirrored his own. The auctioneer shouted over the chaos, his voice strained. "Do I hear 50,000 to start?" A hand shot up. 50! Another rose instantly. 60! The numbers climbed, echoing across the pen, a battle of wealth and pride. The stallion fought against the ropes, the dust thickening with every violent kick. Men shouted over one another, their faces red with determination. Through it all, Ethan stood frozen, his jar of coins clutched tight against his chest. His throat was dry, his hands shaking. He knew he couldn't compete, knew the tiny clinks inside his jar were nothing against the thunder of thousands of dollars. But when Midnight's eyes swept the crowd and locked on his, everything else fell away. The sound of bidding faded, replaced by the hollow rush of blood in Ethan's ears. Midnight's gaze pinned him, sharp and unrelenting, but not cruel. For one long, impossible moment, the boy and the horse simply stared at each other. Two beings from different worlds bound by the same invisible thread. "Ethan," Lily whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Say something. Do something." The boy stepped forward, his legs trembling, and pushed through the crowd until he stood at the front rail. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't shout a number. Instead, he set his jar gently on the ground, climbed up onto the bottom rail, and met Midnight's eyes head-on. "I'm here," he whispered, though no one else could hear. "I'm not going to leave you." The stallion snorted, pawing the ground, but his wild thrashing slowed. The handlers glanced at each other, confused. The crowd fell eerily silent, as if waiting for something they couldn't explain. Harrison leaned forward, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the boy. The auctioneer stammered, glancing nervously at the child in front. Shall we continue? Do I hear 100,000? But no one answered. All eyes were on the boy and the beast, locked in a moment that felt older than the town itself. The sun blazed overhead, the air hung thick with dust, and somewhere in the silence, Ethan felt the world shift beneath his feet. The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to swallow the fair itself. The music from the carousel died, the chatter of vendors and the laughter of children outside the pen faded, and all that remained was the rasping breath of midnight and the quick, shallow rhythm of Ethan's chest. The stallion stood tense in the dust, every muscle quivering as though the earth itself trembled beneath his hooves. His eyes, dark as coal, yet glinting with something unspoken, locked on the boy who dared to step forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few women clutched their hats to their chests. A man muttered under his breath, "That horse'll kill him if he gets any closer." But Ethan didn't hear them. He barely felt the sun scorching the back of his neck or the sweat running down his spine. All he knew was that Midnight wasn't charging, wasn't rearing, wasn't slamming his body against the rails. Instead, the stallion's ears flicked forward. His wild energy paused, suspended like a wave that hadn't yet crashed. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice unsteady through the loudspeakers. "Well, shall we continue the bidding? 100,000. Anyone?" His words trailed into the hot air, unanswered. The bidders who had been so loud a moment ago now sat stiff in their seats, their eyes darting between the boy and the horse as though they were witnessing something that defied logic. Ethan gripped the rail tighter, the wood rough beneath his palms. He leaned forward, his voice no louder than a whisper but steady with a courage he hadn't known he possessed. "It's okay, boy. You're not alone anymore. I see you." Midnight's nostrils flared. He let out a low, guttural snort, but the fury in his eyes dulled. He pawed the ground once, dust puffing into the air, then stilled again. For the first time since he'd entered the ring, his body seemed less like a storm and more like a question. Lily stood just behind Ethan, her hands gripping the hem of her dress. She wanted to pull him back, to shout for someone to stop this madness. But something held her still. The air between Ethan and the stallion vibrated with a strange, undeniable pull. Even she, young as she was, could feel it, a connection that no rope or chain could forge. From his seat near the stage, Harrison leaned forward, his lips pressed into a hard line. He had owned Midnight for years, had spent fortunes on trainers and ranch hands, had watched men thrown to the ground and stomped into the dirt, yet none of them had ever managed to quiet the fire in the stallion's eyes. Now, as he watched a boy no older than 9 stand unflinching before the beast, he felt something twist in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Jealousy, wonder, maybe even regret. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, uncertainty rippling through them. "What's he doing?" someone hissed. "That kid's crazy." Another voice, softer, answered, "Or maybe the horse just knows." The handlers tugged nervously on the ropes, unsure whether to intervene. Midnight tossed his head once, the ropes snapping taut, But then his gaze returned to Ethan, as if he'd already decided the boy was the only thing worth looking at. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He thought of the nights he had stood outside the fence, whispering to midnight, of the hours spent scraping coins into his jar, of his mother's tired eyes begging him to be careful. He thought of Sheriff Collins's stern warning, and then he thought of what it would mean to walk away. The idea crushed him. He couldn't. Not now. Not ever. He climbed higher on the rail, close enough that he could see every fleck of sweat on Midnight's coat. The stallion's ears twitched, but he didn't rear. He simply stared, his chest rising and falling in heavy rhythm. Ethan lifted his small hand, palm open, trembling in the hot air. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "I just want to know you." The crowd held its breath. A bead of sweat rolled down Ethan's temple. Midnight shifted his weight, the muscles in his neck tensing. For an instant, it seemed as though the horse would explode again, thrash and rage until the handlers lost control. But then, slowly, impossibly, he lowered his head, just slightly, as if acknowledging the boy's presence. The sound that followed wasn't applause. Not yet. It was a collective gasp, a wave of disbelief that swept through the stands. Some people whispered prayers under their breath, others simply stared, eyes wide. Even the auctioneer was speechless, his gavel frozen mid-air. Harrison's knuckles whitened as he gripped the arm of his chair. He didn't understand it. He didn't want to understand it. All he knew was that something was happening in that ring, something he couldn't control, something that stripped him of the authority he'd built his entire life upon. Ethan leaned closer, his heart pounding in his ears. "That's it," he whispered. "It's just you and me now." We don't need anyone else to believe Midnight blew out a long breath, the hot air stirring Ethan's hair, and for a moment, the boy could have sworn the stallion's gaze softened, if only by a fraction. The silence broke at last when someone in the crowd shouted, "He's taming him!" The kid's taming the beast. Laughter, awe, and disbelief tangled together in the voices that followed, but none of it mattered to Ethan. All he saw was Midnight, and all he felt was the truth that had lived in his heart since the first time he'd looked through the ranch fence. They belonged to each other. The auctioneer finally found his voice, stumbling over the words. "Well, this is highly irregular. Do I hear another bid?" But Harrison stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "No," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving Ethan and the stallion. "This auction is over." The crowd erupted in confusion. Some shouted protests, others laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Harrison's face was stone. His words were final. And in that moment, Ethan's life, and Midnight's, shifted onto a path no one in Red Bluff could have foreseen. The moment Harrison's words cut through the thick summer air, the crowd erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped, some shrill with disbelief, others booming with laughter. The auctioneer's gavel froze mid-air, his mouth hanging open as if he weren't sure whether he had heard correctly. Men in fine hats twisted in their seats to look at Harrison, their faces flushed with outrage. Women covered their mouths with gloved hands, whispering fiercely to one another. Ethan, still perched on the rail, barely breathed. His heart pounded so loudly he thought the whole town could hear it. His jar of coins sat at his feet, pitiful and small compared to the thunder of the bids that had been called moments ago. He hadn't spoken a number, hadn't raised his hand. Yet here stood the richest man in Red Bluff declaring, in front of everyone, that the wildest horse in the county now belonged to him. Impossible! One of the bidders roared, his voice carrying above the din. I offered 100,000. You can't just… Harrison turned his sharp gaze toward him, silencing the man mid-sentence. I can, he said simply. His voice was cool, but there was a tremor buried deep in it, a note only those watching closely would have heard. He didn't glance at the bidder again. His eyes were locked on the boy and the stallion, as if daring anyone to challenge what had just happened. The auctioneer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching nervously around the handle of his gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, he stammered, it appears the lot is closed. The stallion. Midnight has been sold. He glanced toward Ethan, confusion clouding his face. To the boy. A stunned hush fell over the crowd, and then, like a spark hitting dry grass, it erupted again. To the boy? A child? This is madness. The voices rose and tangled until the sound was deafening. Ethan felt Lily's small hand grip his arm. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. You did it! But Ethan couldn't answer. He couldn't even process what had happened. Midnight's eyes still held his, dark and searching, and it was as though the rest of the world had dissolved around them. The handlers hesitated, their ropes slack in their hands. Midnight no longer fought, no longer screamed. The dust settled around his hooves, and though his body remained taut with power, his gaze was steady, anchored to the boy at the rail. Harrison descended the stage steps slowly, each one echoing like a drumbeat. The crowd parted as he moved, their murmurs swelling like waves. When he reached the ring, he stopped in front of Ethan, his shadow falling over the boy. You heard me? Harrison said, his tone unreadable. He's yours. Ethan blinked up at him, confusion knitting his brow. But I don't have… Harrison cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. Not everything is about money. His gaze flicked toward Midnight, then back to the boy. Sometimes it's about who the animal chooses. The crowd gasped again, their disbelief rippling outward. Some scoffed, some laughed bitterly, but others grew quiet, struck by something they couldn't quite name. Ethan's throat felt dry as he whispered, Why me? For the briefest moment, something cracked in Harrison's mask of control. His eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. Because he looked at you the way he never looked at anyone else, he said, his voice low enough that only Ethan and Lily could hear. And because maybe I need to see what happens when someone else tries a different way. The words puzzled Ethan, but before he could ask, Harrison stepped back. He motioned to the handlers, his voice carrying across the pen. Release him. Gasps broke out as the ropes were loosened. The handlers hesitated, terror etched on their faces, but Harrison's glare gave them no choice. They dropped the ropes and scrambled back. Midnight stood free in the ring, his chest heaving, the crowd holding its collective breath. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, slowly, impossibly, the stallion turned toward Ethan. His massive body gleamed with sweat, his mane wild in the hot breeze. He took one step, then another, the ground trembling beneath his hooves. Dust swirled as he crossed the space between them. Ethan's knees threatened to buckle, but he didn't move away. His small hand reached forward, trembling, open. Midnight lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and the hot breath of the stallion brushed against Ethan's palm. The crowd exploded with shouts and cries. Some screamed in disbelief, others in joy, others in fear. But Ethan didn't hear them. The only sound was Midnight's steady breathing, the only feeling the warmth of the horse's muzzle against his skin. In that instant, boy and stallion became something more than owner and beast. They became a promise, forged in silence, stronger than any contract or price. Lily's eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered, "He's really yours." Ethan swallowed hard, tears threatening his own eyes. "No," he said softly, stroking Midnight's nose as the horse stilled under his touch. "I think I'm his." Behind them, Harrison stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But deep in his chest, he felt something he hadn't in years. A weight lifting, a strange, sharp ache of hope. For the first time, he wasn't the master of the story unfolding before him. The boy and the untamable horse were, and he couldn't look away. The walk back from the fair was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. Midnight's reins, though loose and trembling in his small hands, felt like the weight of destiny itself. The crowd had followed for a while, buzzing with disbelief. But as the dust settled on the road out of Red Bluff, it was only Ethan, Lily, and the towering black stallion who moved together through the evening light. Midnight's massive body loomed beside the boy, each step shaking the ground, each flick of his ears reminding everyone how dangerous he could be. Yet the rope never snapped taut. The horse, feared by men twice Ethan's size, walked quietly at the child's side, as if the world had always meant for them to be paired. When they reached the little house at the edge of town, Ethan's mother stood on the porch, frozen. She had been waiting, pacing, worrying every second since he had run off that morning with his jar of coins. Now, seeing her son return leading a beast larger than any animal she had ever dared approach, her breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking, "what have you done?" Her son's eyes shone with a light she had never seen so brightly before. "He's mine, Mom," Ethan said softly. "Mr. Harrison. He gave him to me." Midnight's home now. Mary's heart lurched between fear and awe. The stallion's coat gleamed like oil in the sinking sun, every muscle shifting with barely contained power. His head towered above the roofline, his eyes sharp and alive. She could see why the town had called him Untamable. But then she looked at her son, at the way Ethan's small hand rested against the animal's neck without a hint of hesitation, and she saw something else. She saw trust, fragile, trembling, but real. Still, reality pressed hard against her chest. "Ethan, we can't keep a horse," she said, her voice trembling. "We can barely keep food on our table. Where will he sleep? What will he eat? Do you have any idea what it takes to care for something this big?" Ethan swallowed, but his voice didn't waver. "I'll work harder. I'll do anything. Please, Mom, just let me try." Midnight shifted, tossing his head, a sharp snort echoing through the yard. Mary flinched, her instincts screaming to pull her son back. But Ethan only tightened his grip on the rope and whispered, "Easy, boy." And to her astonishment, the stallion settled. That first night was chaos. The small shed behind their house, once used for tools and scraps of lumber, became Midnight's shelter. Ethan spread old blankets and hay borrowed from a neighbor, working by lantern light with Lily at his side. The horse paced and kicked at the walls, his hooves striking sparks off the dirt floor. And more than once, Mary begged Ethan to let him go. But Ethan stayed, sitting cross-legged in the dust, whispering stories and promises into the darkness until the stallion finally stilled, his breath slowing, his body lowering to the ground with a heavy sigh. Ethan did not sleep. He sat against the wall of the shed, eyes heavy but unclosing, listening to the rhythm of midnight's breathing. He felt as though the stallion's chest and his own rose and fell together, two hearts beating in time. The days that followed tested every ounce of that fragile bond. Midnight was no easy companion. He snapped ropes, crushed fence posts, and once sent a barrel flying clear across the yard with a single kick. Ethan's mother grew more frantic with each passing day, her fear for her son etched deeper into the lines of her face. Neighbors whispered, shaking their heads when they passed the small house. "That horse will kill him," some muttered. "The sheriff ought to step in before it's too late," said others. But Ethan never gave up. Each morning, before the cicadas began their song, he rose and hurried to Midnight's side. He brushed the stallion's coat until it gleamed, spoke softly, even when the animal lunged or reared, and stood his ground when everyone else warned him to run. Lily helped when she could, carrying buckets of water that sloshed against her knees, her laughter a spark of light, even in the hardest moments. There were nights when Ethan collapsed into bed, his muscles aching, his hands blistered and raw, doubt creeping into his mind like a thief. "What if they're right?" he whispered into the darkness. "What if I can't do this?" But then he remembered the look in Midnight's eyes at the auction, the flicker of recognition, the silent plea. And he found the strength to rise again with the morning sun. The first breakthrough came quietly. Ethan entered the shed late one evening, the lantern throwing long shadows on the walls. Midnight stood restless, his ears twitching, his body tense. Ethan sat down in the dirt, not reaching for the rope this time, not demanding anything. He simply sat, breathing slowly, letting the silence wrap around them. Minutes stretched into hours. Then, at last, Midnight stepped forward. The stallion lowered his head, the warm breath from his nostrils brushing against Ethan's shoulder. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he reached up, gently, and rested his hand on the horse's neck. For the first time, Midnight did not pull away. The world outside remained skeptical, cruel even. But inside that shed, a boy and a horse had begun to build something no one else could see. It was not ownership. It was not control. It was understanding, born of patience and need, a fragile thread binding two lonely souls together. Mary watched from the doorway, her heart torn in two. Fear still clutched her, but so did pride. She saw her son's determination hardening into something unshakable. And though she whispered prayers into the night for his safety, she also whispered thanks for the strange miracle that had begun in her own backyard. Ethan knew the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But as Midnight's head pressed gently against his shoulder in the dim light, he believed, with all the strength of his young heart, that they would walk it together. Harrison had not planned to see the boy again. When he left the fair that day, his chest had felt heavy in a way he could not explain, as if he had set loose not only a horse, but something long buried inside himself. He had told himself it was over. Midnight was no longer his burden. Yet as the days passed, he found his thoughts circling back to the scene at the auction ring. The boy's trembling hand, the stallion's steady gaze, the hush that had fallen over the crowd, as if they had witnessed something sacred. From the wide porch of his mansion, Harrison could see the town in the distance, a smudge of roofs and church steeples against the flat horizon. He told himself he had business elsewhere, contracts waiting, land deals to close. But his feet betrayed him. One late afternoon, as the sun baked the earth into gold and the cicadas sang their endless chorus, he found himself steering his truck down the dirt road that led to the small house on the edge of Red Bluff. The house looked even smaller up close, patched with boards of mismatched wood, the yard cluttered with rusting tools, and the pale skeleton of an old swing. Yet, in the back, beyond the shed that leaned like it might collapse any moment, stood the black stallion. Midnight towered against the sky, his coat shining even in the dust, his mane tossing in the hot wind. And beside him, barefoot in the dirt, stood Ethan. The boy was brushing the stallion's neck with slow, deliberate strokes, his face set in concentration. Midnight shifted and stamped once, but did not pull away. Harrison stopped in the road, leaning against the hood of his truck, watching in silence. The scene tugged at something in him he had long thought dead. At last, Ethan noticed him. The boy froze, his hand still on the horse's neck. Midnight lifted his head, ears flicking, and gave a low snort. But he did not rear. Ethan narrowed his eyes, suspicion flashing across his young face. "What are you doing here?" His voice was small, but steady. Harrison straightened, brushing dust from his suit jacket, though there was no reason to. "I came to see if the horse was still alive," he said dryly. Ethan bristled, his hand tightening against Midnight's mane. "He's fine." Better than fine? Harrison's gaze moved over the animal. Midnight looked strong, restless, his muscles quivering beneath his skin. But there was something different, something he had never seen in all his years of owning the stallion. Midnight was calm, not tamed, never tamed, but calm in a way that unsettled Harrison. "You'll get yourself killed," Harrison said at last, his voice low. "That horse isn't a pet. He's fire. Fire doesn't change just because you wish it to." Ethan's chin lifted. Maybe he doesn't have to change. Maybe he just needs someone who won't be afraid of him. The man blinked, the boy's words cutting sharper than he expected. He thought of the years he had spent trying to dominate the stallion, breaking men in the process, and the bitterness of failure that had clung to him. Perhaps he had never considered that the problem wasn't Midnight at all. Perhaps the problem had been him. Mary appeared in the doorway then, wiping her hands on her apron, her face tightening at the sight of Harrison. "Why are you here?" she asked sharply. Harrison inclined his head, his tone clipped. "Checking on the horse." Nothing more. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't trust him. She had no reason to. But she said nothing, only stepped onto the porch, her presence a shield between the man and her son. Harrison looked at Ethan one last time. The boy's small figure stood beside the massive stallion, a contrast so stark it seemed almost impossible. Yet in that moment, Harrison understood what the others at the auction had felt. Midnight had chosen. Not with fear, not with violence, but with a quiet acceptance. And Harrison, for all his wealth and power, could not change it. He turned back to his truck, the weight in his chest heavier than before. As he drove away, dust rising in his wake, he found himself gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The boy's words lingered, echoing against the walls of his mind. Maybe he just needs someone who won't be afraid of him. For the first time in many years, Harrison wondered if all his life he had mistaken control for strength. And if perhaps, just perhaps, A boy with nothing but a heart full of stubborn hope might have understood the truth better than he ever had. The Texas sky had a way of warning those who paid attention. All day, the air felt heavy, the clouds piling like bruises above the horizon, and the wind carried the smell of rain before a single drop had fallen. Ethan sensed it in his bones as he worked in the yard, hauling water to Midnight's shed, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. Even Midnight seemed restless, his hooves stamping at the dirt, his ears twitching with a nervous energy that made Ethan's own chest tighten. By late afternoon, the light had turned strange, yellow and dim, the sun swallowed by rolling clouds. Lily had stopped by to help. Her laughter unusually subdued as the air thickened with tension. "Feels like the world's holding its breath," she murmured, glancing skyward. Ethan nodded, his hand brushing Midnight's mane. The stallion tossed his head and let out a sharp snort, the whites of his eyes flashing. Mary stepped out onto the porch, her apron clinging to her frame as the first gusts swept across the fields. "Ethan, bring him inside seat," she shouted above the wind. "That shed won't hold if the storm hits hard." But there was no time. The wind came roaring like a freight train, bending trees and ripping loose shingles from rooftops. The first crack of thunder split the air, and Midnight reared violently, kicking against the walls of the shed. The boards groaned under his strength, one snapping like a matchstick. "Ethan!" Lily screamed, clutching her skirt as the rain began to lash sideways. Without thinking, Ethan dashed into the shed. Dust and hay swirled in the air as Midnight thrashed, his massive body colliding with the walls. The lantern tipped over, rolling in the dirt, its flame hissing out in the downpour that spilled through the broken roof. The boy's heart pounded, but he didn't hesitate. He threw his arms around Midnight's neck, his small frame dwarfed by the stallion's wild strength. "It's okay," Ethan cried, his voice hoarse against the storm. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Midnight's body heaved beneath him, muscles trembling with fear, but the boy held on, pressing his face against the soaked mane. The rain hammered the roof, lightning lit the world in stark flashes, and thunder rolled so loud it shook the ground. Mary stood at the doorway, her face pale with terror, her voice torn from her throat. "Ethan, get out of there!" But Ethan didn't move. He could feel the stallion's heart pounding, frantic and wild, and he knew if he let go, Midnight would shatter everything around him. "I won't let you be alone," he whispered, words swallowed by the storm, but carried in the boy's breath. Slowly, so slowly it felt like time itself had stilled. Midnight's frantic movements began to ease. His rearing slowed, his hooves struck the earth with less force, his breathing softened. He lowered his head, pressing it against Ethan's shoulder, as the boy clung tighter, both of them trembling as if one heart beat between them. The storm raged on outside, but within that fragile circle of trust, something unbreakable was forged. Mary's hands shook as she covered her mouth, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. From the road, headlights cut through the sheets of water. Harrison's truck, creeping closer, its tires sliding in the mud. He stepped out into the downpour, his suit plastered to his skin, his silver hair dripping, and he froze at the sight before him. The boy and the horse locked together in the center of the collapsing shed. Harrison's chest ached as he watched, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. He had fought this horse for years, tried to break him with force and fear, and failed every time. Yet here was a child, half the size of Midnight's neck, calming him with nothing but words and a heart that refused to give up. When at last the worst of the storm passed and the thunder rolled into the distance, Ethan and Midnight remained as they were. still, silent, together. The boy's clothes clung to him, his body shaking with exhaustion, but he would not release the stallion until he felt the last of the trembling leave Midnight's frame. The shed stood broken, boards scattered across the yard, the lantern drowned in mud. But in the wreckage lay something stronger than walls, a bond that no storm could tear apart. Mary rushed forward, pulling Ethan into her arms as he finally stumbled free. Midnight stood beside them, towering and dark against the fading storm, his head lowered as if he too were spent. Lily cried openly, relief and awe shining in her face. And Harrison, drenched and silent, could not look away. For the first time, the man who had built his life on ownership and control felt powerless in the face of something far greater. He knew, with a clarity that cut to the bone, that the boy had achieved in a single night what he had failed to grasp in years. Midnight wasn't conquered. Midnight was understood. The storm had left broken fences, scattered shingles, and a field littered with debris. But in its wake, it had given Red Bluff something it had never seen before. A boy and a horse who no longer belonged to anyone but each other. The morning after the storm broke over, Red Bluff was strange and quiet. The sky was washed clean, a pale blue stretching endlessly overhead, but the ground bore the scars of the night's fury. Branches lay strewn across the road, fences sagged, and the roof of Mary's little house leaked with every drip that fell into the buckets she had set beneath it. The shed where Midnight had fought his terror was half collapsed, its timbers warped and split, but the stallion himself stood tall in the yard, his coat glistening in the new sun. He was calmer than anyone had ever seen him, and for the first time since he had come into Ethan's life, he looked less like a storm and more like a survivor. Ethan woke stiff and sore, his body aching from the night before. He shuffled barefoot across the damp floorboards to peer out the window. There was Midnight, head bowed as he cropped the grass, the morning light shining on his sleek black coat. Ethan's heart swelled with something too large for words. Against all odds, the horse was still here, still his. He pulled on his boots and rushed outside, ignoring the ache in his muscles, and pressed his forehead to Midnight's neck. The stallion blew out a warm breath and stood still. It was the smallest gesture, but for Ethan, it was everything. Mary came out carrying a battered coffee mug, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She studied, her son and the horse, her face caught between fear and pride. "You scared me half to death last night," she said quietly. "I thought I was going to lose you." Ethan looked up at her, his voice earnest. "I couldn't leave him, Mom. He needed me. And I needed him too." Before she could answer, the low growl of an engine echoed down the road. Harrison's truck appeared through the morning haze, dust kicking up behind it. Mary stiffened, her fingers tightening on her mug, while Ethan instinctively placed a hand on Midnight's neck, as if shielding him from whatever this visit meant. Harrison stepped out slowly, his boots crunching on the wet ground. He looked older than before, the lines on his face etched deeper, his silver hair still damp from the night. He paused for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the boy and the horse standing together in the wreckage of the storm. The sight stirred something in him that unsettled his carefully constructed world. Mary's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness. "What do you want?" Harrison adjusted his jacket, though it was clear he had no rehearsed speech. His eyes never left Ethan. "I came to make an offer." Ethan's stomach tightened. His grip on Midnight's mane grew firmer. "You can't take him back," he blurted, his voice trembling. "He's mine now." Harrison raised a hand slowly, as if calming the boy. "I didn't come to take him. I meant what I said at the auction. He's yours. But a horse like that? He won't survive long if you're trying to care for him with nothing but scraps and willpower. You don't have the resources. You need help." Mary stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Help from you? And what price comes with that help, mister? Harrison?" For once, Harrison didn't meet her fire with arrogance. His shoulders sagged, his voice softened. "No price. Not the kind you think. I'll cover his feed, his medicine, even help you rebuild that shed. On one condition, Ethan takes responsibility for his training, his care, every choice. I won't interfere. I just want to see him survive, and see what the boy can do." The silence stretched heavy. Mary studied him with suspicion, her instincts warning her against the man who had always taken more than he gave. But Ethan's heart pounded with something different. He heard the condition not as a burden, but as a chance. A chance to prove himself, to prove to the world that Midnight wasn't a lost cause. "Why?" Ethan asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me after everything?" Harrison's eyes darkened with something unspoken. "Because I saw what you did last night. I saw a horse I could never reach lay his head against a boy who refused to let go. And because," he added, his voice rough, "I need to know if there's another way besides fear and force." Mary's lips tightened. She wanted to refuse, to send him away, to protect her son from the weight of this man's shadow. But when she looked at Ethan's face, she saw his eyes burning with the same fire that had carried him through the storm. She couldn't crush that, not after seeing how far it had taken him. Ethan turned to her, his voice steady. "Mom, I can do this. With his help, Midnight can have what he needs. Please." The boy's plea broke something inside her. She nodded once, her voice low. "Then we'll accept. But remember, Ethan, this is still our home. And he," she glanced at Harrison, "doesn't get to own us." Harrison inclined his head, accepting her terms. He looked at Ethan one last time, something like respect flickering in his expression. Then it settled. As he walked back to his truck, Ethan pressed his face against Midnight's neck, whispering into the stallion's mane. "We're going to be okay now. I'll take care of you. I promise." The storm had left ruin in its wake, but it had also delivered something unexpected. Not just survival, but a fragile alliance. And in that uneasy partnership, a new chapter of Midnight's story had begun. One written not in chains or commands, but in trust, and in the stubborn heart of a boy who refused to let go. Word of the storm, and what had happened in the shed, spread through Red Bluff faster than the wind that had ripped shingles from rooftops. By the next morning, whispers trailed Ethan wherever he went. Some called him foolish, others called him brave, but all agreed on one thing. The boy and the black stallion were no longer just a curiosity. They were a story that belonged to the town itself. At the diner where Mary worked, customers leaned across their coffee cups, voices low but urgent. "They say the horse laid his head right on the boy's shoulder," one man whispered. "Didn't fight, didn't buck. Just stood there like a dog." Another shook his head in disbelief. "That animal near killed 3 grown men. And now a 9-year-old has him eating out of his hand? Doesn't sound real." Mary said nothing, carrying plates and refilling mugs, but her hands trembled every time she thought of the sight herself. Her son, drenched and shaking, clutching a beast larger than any man, and somehow surviving. Ethan felt the weight of those eyes when he walked through town. People stared openly, their conversations halting as he passed. Children pointed and whispered, "That's him, the boy with the horse." Some of the older ranch hands tipped their hats, a gesture of respect mingled with wariness. Others scoffed. "It won't last," one man muttered as Ethan walked by. "That horse will turn on him soon enough." Ethan heard every word, but he kept his head high. He had learned not to let doubt steal his fire. Back at home, midnight had become both a spectacle and a secret. The neighbors would sometimes wander close to the fence, peering over to catch a glimpse of the notorious stallion now standing quietly beside, the boy who brushed his coat. Children begged their parents to let them watch, but few dared to get too close. Midnight remained restless, unpredictable, his hooves striking sparks against the dirt whenever strangers drew near. Yet when Ethan's voice reached him, calm and steady, the fire in the stallion's eyes dimmed to embers. One afternoon, Sheriff Collins arrived, his broad frame filling the gate as he leaned against the post. His eyes were cautious, but not unkind. "You've caused quite a stir, Ethan," he said. "Half the town thinks you've got a gift. The other half thinks you're one step away from disaster." Ethan stood barefoot in the yard, his small hand resting on Midnight's shoulder. "Maybe both are true," he admitted. "But I'm not giving up on him." Colin studied the boy for a long moment, then the horse. Midnight's ears twitched, but he didn't rear or strike. "I've seen men lose their lives because they thought they could outstare a wild animal," the sheriff said finally. "But you don't seem to be fighting him. You're just standing with him." Ethan nodded. "Because he doesn't need someone to fight him. He needs someone to believe in him." The sheriff exhaled slowly, tipping his hat before walking back toward town. "Well, son, you've got more grit than most men I know. Just be careful. The town's watching, and not everyone wants to see you succeed." Lily remained Ethan's closest ally, her faith unwavering. She spent hours by his side, carrying water, gathering hay, or simply sitting in the dirt while Ethan whispered to Midnight. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes she argued with him about methods, but never once did she leave. "Let them talk," she told him one evening as the sun sank low, turning the sky to fire. "They don't know you like I do." They don't know him either. Harrison, true to his word, kept sending supplies, bales of hay, sacks of grain, even a proper brush and bridle. Yet each delivery stirred new whispers in town. Some claimed he was testing the boy, others said he was plotting to take the horse back when Ethan failed. Harrison himself remained a mystery. He came rarely, always standing apart, his eyes unreadable as he watched the boy and the stallion. When asked why he bothered at all, he only replied, "Because some stories are worth seeing through." The weeks after the storm stretched into something strange for Red Bluff. The fair was long gone, the fields buzzing again with work, but the boy and the horse remained the center of every conversation. For a town used to sameness, it was like watching a living legend unfold in their dusty streets. And for Ethan, though the weight of their stares sometimes pressed heavy on his shoulders, he carried it with pride. Every brushstroke across Midnight's coat, every whispered word in the quiet of the shed, was proof that the bond between them was real. Not everyone believed, but he didn't need them to. Midnight believed. And that was enough. As summer deepened, the boy and the stallion walked the fields together. their shadows stretching long against the horizon. And from porches and fence lines, the people of Red Bluff kept watching, caught between doubt and wonder, knowing they were witnessing something rare, something that might change them all. The first hints of spring came quietly to Red Bluff, carried on softer breezes that stirred the tall grass and painted the fields in shades of green. After the long weeks of winter storms and heavy skies, the land seemed to breathe again, and so did the people who worked it. For Ethan, spring meant something more. It meant a chance to ride midnight, not as a dream, but as a truth. A chance to see the stallion's power stretch out beneath him across the open plains. On a morning washed in golden light, Ethan led Midnight from the shed, his hands steady as he tightened the bridle Harrison had given him months before. The stallion stamped once, the sound echoing across the quiet yard, but his eyes were calm, focused on the boy who had never left his side. Lily leaned on the fence, her face glowing with excitement, while Mary stood on the porch, arms crossed, her heart caught between fear and pride. She had seen too much to deny what her son had accomplished, but the sight of him preparing to climb onto Midnight's back still stole her breath. "Are you sure about this?" Mary called, her voice tight. Ethan nodded, his jaw firm. "He's ready." "And so am I." The boy placed one small foot in the stirrup, his fingers gripping the leather, and with a determined pull, he swung onto the horse's back. Midnight shifted beneath him, powerful muscles tensing, but he did not buck or rear. Instead, he let out a deep breath, as though acknowledging that this moment belonged to them both. Ethan leaned forward, his hands resting gently against the horse's neck. "Let's go, boy," he whispered. And with a nudge of his heels, Midnight leapt forward. They surged across the field like a shadow come alive, the stallion's mane whipping in the wind, his hooves striking the earth in a rhythm that felt like thunder. The world blurred around them, the fences, the trees, the town shrinking to nothing as the horizon opened wide. Ethan clung to the reins, his laughter breaking free, wild and unrestrained. For the first time, he wasn't just a boy with a dream. He was a rider. And Midnight was no longer untamable. He was free. Lily's cheers rang faintly behind them, and Mary's hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But Ethan heard none of it. All he knew was the wind in his hair, the pounding of Midnight's hooves, and the steady beat of two hearts finally in sync. When they slowed at last, stopping atop a hill where the land rolled out like an ocean of grass, Ethan slid from Midnight's back and pressed his forehead against the stallion's. "We did it," he said, whispered. "We found our place." Midnight's warm breath answered him, and for a moment, the boy believed the horse understood every word. It was then that Harrison appeared at the edge of the field, his truck parked by the fence. He didn't approach right away, only watched, his figure outlined against the sky. When he finally walked forward, his boots crunching in the grass, there was no trace of the proud, unyielding man who had once stood at the auction ring. His eyes, though still sharp, carried something gentler, something heavier. "You've done what no one else could," Harrison said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I tried to own him, tried to control him. But you," he shook his head, his throat tightening, "you didn't break him. You set him free, and in doing that, you set something free in me too." Ethan looked up at him, unsure what to say. He was just a boy, and Harrison's words carried the weight of years he could not yet understand. But in the silence between them, something shifted. The man and the child, so different, shared a truth neither could deny. They had both been changed by the same horse. Mary and Lily joined them on the hill, their faces glowing in the spring light. Together, the four of them stood in quiet reverence, watching as Midnight tossed his head and pawed the ground, eager to run again. The town of Red Bluff would keep telling its stories, some with laughter, some with doubt, some with awe. But Ethan no longer cared about the whispers. He had found what he had been searching for. Not ownership, not glory, but connection. Midnight was not his possession. Midnight was his companion, his freedom, his home. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan climbed back onto Midnight's back. With Lily's laughter carrying on the wind and his mother's tears shining in the fading light, he urged the stallion forward once more. Harrison watched them disappear into the distance, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart heavy and light all at once. And so it was that a poor boy and an untamable horse found each other in a world that had no place for either of them. They found freedom not in chains or control, but in trust, in loyalty, in love. For Ethan, for Midnight, and for those who had witnessed their story, life in Red Bluff would never be the same again. And that was the story of Ethan and Midnight. Proof that love and trust can tame even the wildest spirit. Now, I want to hear from you. If you believe that kindness is stronger than money, just drop a simple one in the comments. If you think money still rules the world, type 0. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might touch your heart even deeper than this one.